Welcome to the Growth Over Grades podcast, a show connecting you with thought leaders, pioneers, and change agents who are leading the charge to support schools and districts in making the shift toward competency-based education and to promote growth over grades. I'm Jordan Lewis, and on the show today, we hear from author, innovator, and Director of Digital Learning and Innovation, Jed Stefanowicz from Nashoba Regional Schools. Jed's passion for transforming teaching and learning through effective technology integration has made him a sought-after speaker, coach, and author, spanning a career in education for over 30 years. His book, aimed toward digital learning, Activate, Innovate, Motivate, encapsulates his philosophy of creating engaging and equitable digital learning environments that truly motivate students. In this episode, we dive into Jed's strategies for building digital learning capacity among staff and students, and chat about keeping the focus on teaching and learning and not on the latest tech gadget. We drill into building a culture on content creation to empower student voice and shift the narrative of our classrooms to one of skill development and growth, not just a letter grade. Hear how Jed has helped to bring new strategies online tied to Nashoba's Portrait of a Graduate, and how through leveraging a digital literacy framework, your district can put your portrait into the hands of students. Now, on to my conversation with Jed Stefanowicz.
Jed, thank you so much for joining us and for coming on today's show. I'm really excited about today's topic of conversation. I know you've been really busy over the past several months, whether it be writing books, whether it be supporting your district, and we just can't thank you enough for spending some time with us today to share your insights and, of course, also share your love for coffee with us here today.
Well, without further ado, because I am in Massachusetts, there's a Dunkin' within reach. So, Jordan, great to see you. Thanks for having me back on. I appreciate it. And I love hanging out and chatting with you off the air, and I'm happy to do it on the air and talk about everything we're passionate about with teaching and learning that really matters.
I love it. And for the listeners, we won't go into extreme detail about the coffee cup graveyard that we did find here on my desk. I was just telling Jed, when you get into the trenches of recording episodes and stuff, it's easy. You need your caffeine fix. And I appreciate it. And Jed came prepared here, not only with his caffeine, but with his insights. And Jed, let's just kind of kick it off. For the people that maybe haven't listened to your previous episode of the show, just talk to us about your background in education and the journey that you've taken to get to where you are today.
Sure. It does not include Olympic breakdancing, and I'm sad to say apparently it won't include Olympic breakdancing in the future because it was a one and done. So sad to see it go. I actually loved it. I thought it was awesome. The finals, anyway. Yes. So this is year 30 for me in teaching and learning. I was a third grade teacher for 22 years, a digital learning coach for 6. And now I am the Director of Digital Learning and Innovation at Nashoba Regional School District here in Massachusetts. As a classroom teacher, I was, I came with the internet, came with computers in classrooms. I was one using a lot of technology and really shifting toward digital learning and thinking about digital practices more so than the products, and really having to think about teaching and learning and hoping to think about teaching and learning differently. And the more that I did, the more connections, relationships, and ways to teach and learn differently emerged. And that's what moved me into the space of digital learning coach, sharing that with other educators as well as students. And now I joined central administration. So here I am in a district leadership role, and I love it.
And Jed, when we were chatting a little bit off camera for those that are watching, or off audio for those that are purely listening, you did mention that with the shift that you've made into central leadership, your perspective on teaching and learning has changed. Can you just share with us a little bit about what does that mean to you? Like, how have these shifts happened? What is this new perspective?
Well, part of it is I was that teacher early on who was I came from that mentality of ask forgiveness, not permission, piloting, being an early adopter and trying things out. And I want to try to find a way to foster that same creativity, build kind of that culture in ways from a more systemic point of view. And so I see things, structurally differently than I had seen them just as a classroom teacher, because I am connected to, I guess, all classrooms and all buildings across our 3 little towns in ways that hopefully I can have some leverage that spans beyond just four walls in one room. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that's the part that's exciting for me. It works more slowly than it does with a teacher who comes back from a conference and wants to just blow it up and try something the next day. I love that enthusiasm. So part of my role as a director of digital learning is trying to harness that. And what is that mojo that someone who comes back from a conference and wants to try something? And then how can we scale that? Now I've become the enforcer of compliance and data privacy and understanding it and hopefully explaining it to classroom teachers why all those steps are in place and finding ways to bring tools into our classroom and put tools into students' hands for creativity and really building that culture of content creation, not just content consuming.
And I know we're going to lean into that content creation piece in depth in a few minutes, but one thing that I'm really curious about as you're sharing about seeing the bigger picture and helping to bring teachers' excitements, you're harnessing that excitement, but also working to bring it to all the classrooms to make that big impact. I know that within your district, you're doing a lot of work around this idea of the portrait of a graduate. Share with us a little bit about kind of where that framework came. Like, what was the catalyst to kind of start bringing this portrait of a graduate online? Like, why now with this portrait of a graduate?
Sure. Well, our district actually began the process before I came to Nashoba, which is great. And I think, a lot of our neighboring districts have, and I think Nashoba is going about it in a really responsible and forward-thinking way. I think what I see sometimes in other districts is where there's a lot of time spent, sometimes a lot of money spent having outside consultants in and building, what is your district's vision and the portrait of a graduate that ends up yielding a really nice poster. And it ends up, in some cases, that becomes a finish line. I like the way that our district, and I think districts that do a portrait or profile really well, is that that's not the finish line. That's the beginning of the process. And it's not one that exists two-dimensionally on a mug or a sticker or a poster, but it becomes the guiding structure behind strategic planning, behind instructional shifts. But that's a process. And that's the part that's been exciting for me, is to really look at the dimension behind the portrait of a graduate, identifying what are the learner competencies, what do we even mean by learner competencies, and does everyone really get it, from the leadership all the way right through to students? And it's not that part with students is overlooked, but I think that part is probably more critical than any. If you're asking students to build eventual profiles or portfolios to demonstrate those competencies, what does that really mean? What does that really look like? And why does it really matter?
I'm really curious to double tap on this idea of communicating and rolling out the poster. Because like you said, that that's the starting place, but there's so much more. And for the listeners that are at that stage of development where you have that poster, I think this is a really important point to put the cell phone away and really lean in. Because I'm curious, Jed, from your perspective, how do you see this beginning from that communication standpoint? How are you talking to your teachers about it so that they get the buy-in? How are you communicating this with stakeholders, whether that's family members, business members in the community? Like, how is that communication taking place?
We're trying to make it really visible everywhere. And I think districts that do it well do that, so that, yes, there will be standardized test scores, and that is one data source. And as important as test scores are student demonstrations of learning. And if we're talking about learner competencies, we're prioritizing those ways that students can really demonstrate learning, demonstrate understanding, demonstrate perseverance, demonstrate grit through the skills within the standards. So if you're a standards-based district and it's a standard-based instructional model, what are the skills within those standards? And more importantly, what are the metrics and measures by which students are enabled to demonstrate those skills in transferable ways? So that learner transfer model, how are students really applying what they're learning in ways that are meaningful to them? Because if it's not, and I think I'm going to keep saying that word, if it doesn't matter, it's not going to matter. And, it begs that question: how often are districts or are any educators or leaders inadvertently, hopefully, how often are they perpetuating a compliance curriculum where
Right.
reporting just becomes a compliance checklist and not really a report card of tomorrow that really indicates the ways in which students are ready for their future?
And as you mentioned, the idea that it has to help students with that knowledge transfer is just, it's resonating really heavily with me, because so often we see when we capture student voice that they don't understand the connection, or they can't make that transfer into real world applications of what they're learning in the classroom. And I most recently was just chatting with a student who was a part of a specialized program where it was an entrepreneurship program. He was able to receive some grant money to start a business. And when speaking with the student, I asked him, what is the most important takeaway that you're having from this experience? Is it that you got to create a business? He said, no, it's that I was able to finally make connections to what I'm learning in school to the real world and begin to apply it. So with that kind of story in mind, Jed, how do you feel like you're changing that culture so teachers aren't looking at it from a compliance perspective, and you are supporting students and saying, demonstrate your learning, but in different ways?
Well, that's the whole challenge, right? Because as data is increasingly collected and connected and curated, how is it that the data tells a story? And teachers and leadership teams take the time to see the stories within that data so that they're understanding the students that are behind those digits, right? When you were talking about that student in that pathway, I was thinking specifically about, our buildings are full of kids who can't wait to get out of school because there are other things waiting for them. They're either they're content creating on YouTube. They have other things going on. And why is it that those muscles aren't being exercised in school? It's like sometimes school becomes space where those muscles aren't flexed. And how do we develop those muscles that are the ones that are already, it's not for their future, it's for their now.
Right.
It's not what do you want to be when you grow up. It's what do you want to be when you get home this afternoon? Because we have students who are so involved, whether it's, in the workplace or some in industry or some, creating content in ways that it's laughable at times when they think about using those skills in school, when really that's what we really need to be doing, is getting those muscles engaged in school so that there is that direct connection, so it feels meaningful, so that there is a real life application of those skills, so the learning transfer makes sense in ways that are also measurable for teachers. So what that means, back to your question, is sometimes restructuring assessments or reevaluating particular assessments in ways that are not just memorization recall, but you're really asking students to demonstrate that learning in application, in context, for a purpose. When you've got that authenticity, that's when you begin to shift the mindset of students. You begin to shift the mindset of the educators. And, make no mistake, it is a big shift, but mindsets build skill sets. So if you can shift the mindset, I think then you'll begin to be able to work on building the skill sets that we're really saying matter. And I think we agree that they matter. They're not soft skills, right? If they are competencies, we're talking about competencies, really the ability to affect change, the ability to solve a problem, the ability to apply learning in a real life scenario that matters. But it takes work, and it's probably harder to grade. It's probably harder to create assignments. You're differentiating across levels, but otherwise, if it's not going to matter to students, you are perpetuating that compliance curriculum.
And there's definitely a few things to unpack here. One item just around that idea of shifting mindset, and I wanted to double click on the idea that you said we're shifting mindset for students, but also the mindset of educators. And when we think back to that big question of why are we asking students what they want to be for the future, but instead shift our minds to say, what do you want to be in the now? I think is a really powerful way to begin that transformation for educators who might be stuck or facing a wall and going, I don't know what to do next. Ask yourself that question. pose that question to the students. What do you want to be when you go home today? What do you want to be on the weekend? And use that to start setting some short-term goals that can help propel to the longer term and start answering some of those questions, I think is a really important place to start from a mindset perspective.
Or maybe even, what are you already? Not what do you want to be? You know, we forget to ask students, what are they already doing? What skills do they already bring? What are the, especially with technology and digital learning, what's their level? What's their capacity that in many cases will exceed their teachers, whether it's AI, whether it's, you know, whatever the digital fluency is. That creates a really interesting dynamic where you have a fluency greater by the students than that of their teachers. Right. That's a really interesting shift where the adult in the room is, you know, not the holder of the knowledge, and it changes the direction flow, and not everyone's on board for that, students and teachers alike. But it really sets up a different opportunity for a powerful dynamic where you can model lead learning as an adult to embrace either emerging technology or different methodologies, but then as a student to also bring in that knowledge base and that skill set to be a resource for peers, resource for adults in the room. And I'm not talking about, you know, replacing keys on a keyboard. I'm really talking about thinking about emerging technologies differently. And AI just happens to be, you know, top of mind, as they say.
Of course. And, you know, I think if you were to poll 9 of 10 educators, they would probably lean into AI as that emerging technology. But we know there are tons of really amazing technologies that students are immersed in that we don't even understand because there isn't that opportunity to bring it into the classroom. But it's interesting that you talk about the shift in the role of the teacher through these models. We hear that a lot from the leader, that moving into a competency-based system does support that shift with the role of the teacher. And it just makes me think, Jed, when you're talking about these broader systematic shifts being hard work, and it makes me wonder of how much of this is, you know, yes, there's the hard work in making those shifts. You have to think critically, got to reflect on your practice. But at the same time, I wonder how much of this, you know, are teachers already doing? And perhaps there's not a name for it. They aren't calling out that they're doing these things, and there's not a space for them to celebrate that. Is that something that you see happening when you're talking with your teachers in the classroom at all?
Yeah, I think so. And that's why, you know, there's traction behind a portrait of a graduate, is that, you know, whatever the competency becomes named, whether it's, you know, a learner's mindset or perseverance or grit or whatever, it's putting a name to some of those things that have been really important to teachers, and maybe they've historically been taught kind of on the side, or the soft skill in conjunction with the names and dates and key learning objectives that have to be demonstrated through more standardized measures. But now there's a prioritization toward those skills, and I think that's where it becomes important. But, you know, you've got the situation sometimes where your portrait of a graduate just becomes, like I said earlier, two-dimensional, or the end point, or, you know, it's kind of like a receipt. I think early portrait of a graduate was like a receipt at the end of a long transaction of learning exchanges where the content was delivered. Whereas I think a better mindset, better model to think about it, it's almost like a licensure or a qualification, or, you know, whatever it is that empowers those students through those competencies so that they feel that they're now going into the world, not necessarily after they graduate, but they're able to articulate how they can demonstrate those skills in ways that matter in school, out of school, after school, all those ways, so that it becomes rich and real.
As we start to think about this idea of students demonstrating their learning, and we've talked about that, and there's a ton of different models that we know exist in terms of how a student can demonstrate that learning, whether it be in the classroom with the teacher, whether it be leveraging digital technologies like a portfolio. We're seeing a lot of traction with models like this demonstration or defensive learning, where you present your experiences to a panel of community members, reflect on how this is going to help prepare you for being future ready. I've seen student showcases where they get similar opportunities. So there's a lot of different models. I'm curious, Jed, because I know you're doing a lot of work on personalizing the approach to your portrait of a graduate. So how does that sort of play in when we think about first personalizing the approach, and how does that then better support a student in demonstrating their understanding?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it makes it matter. Then it's not a district agenda. What you're really doing is giving students the tools to learn about themselves. And by the way, the teachers are learning about you too as a way of better supporting that instructional process. But by personalizing it, some of the things this summer or over the past 6 or 12 months that I've been really trying to think about are what are the ways that either that information can be visualized. So really shifting from the portrait of a graduate, which to me is, again, it's that endpoint receipt, to shifting more to the model, like you were saying, with a profile of a learner. Right. And that is all the way K to 12. And that's the development of those skills rather than just rating where do you stand on them. So I think having students have a really clear voice in that process where they can engage and understand what does a learner competency look like in action, what are the attributes that are aligned with it, and then allowing students to do some self-scoring. So some of the things and they're not dramatically powerful or unique, but they were lacking in a sense that I wanted to create those tools to put students back into the process. So again, to peel it off the poster, to bring it in with dimension and depth in kind of a 3D way. 3 of the tools that I developed, one is just takes a simple spreadsheet, and for each of our 6 learner competencies, first students just say 1 through 5, where do I think I might fall on each of these 5 categories? That creates a little 3D donut ring, right? The second one, there are 12 attributes, just single word attributes for each of the competencies. And students just rate how well do I think I align with this word. So it could be creative, could be resourceful, could be open-minded, right? So they're all aligned with our 6 competencies. And then, that spreadsheet generates a visualization. But what I like about that visualization is side by side, I was intentional about creating those rings because visually the ring is a complete whole, whereas a bar chart that just rates those competencies, it says the same data, but it really looks different. When it's a ring, you have a whole, and the distribution of those skills may look different. So first, it's interesting to see where they would predict, and then based on their checklist, where does it result? And then, so the comparison between those, and then just the data that it shows themselves, just for students to really get a sense of where are their strength areas, where are their focus areas. This might be an area to work on. The next piece, this was a really awesome learning experience that after ISTE, I came home and I had seen Ethan Mollick, who had done a demo as one of the keynotes. And I used an AI tool. I've never written a line of code in my life. I don't know JavaScript. I've never used HTML. I'm not a coder, never have been. But using an AI tool, I used Claude, and I just said, I want to create an interactive tool for students that these are our learner competencies. These are the indicators. This is the evidence we talk about. And I said, I want to make an interactive dashboard where it asks students this information. The data is represented on a radar chart or a spider chart. There are reflection questions that follow up. These are our topics. These are the questions. So it wasn't generating any of that for me. What it was doing was, I said, and I want it to be interactive and I want it to be a website. It actually created the JavaScript code for me. I was able to dump it right into a Google site. And now, a student can go onto that site, just answer an inventory that is comprised of, 8, how would I answer this question? Some of them are more just checklist questions. Some are scenarios. I encounter a viewpoint that I might not agree with in class. What do I do when there are 4 choices? Or I just had my first class period of a course and I realize I have no interest in the subject. What do I do? So scenario-based questions. And then, similar to the spreadsheet, this one automatically creates that radar chart. So you've got a radar and it creates a hexagon where the legs are pointed closer to each of the competencies. But again, it's just a visualizer. But when your data is visualized that way, you've got students directly doing that self-inventory, self-reflection. This does not feel like a compliance task. And, there are reflection questions. Students can import them. I would prefer to have students just kind of think about those reflection questions because they shouldn't matter in terms of a grade. There isn't a right or wrong. If a teacher wants to grade whether they're done or not, fine. But that wasn't the point of generating them. So I was really happy with that turned out. And then the third one is I used a different AI tool to create a chatbot. And what the chatbot does, I just fed it, these are 6 competency names. And I just said, engage students to get a dialogue going about these 6 competencies, make sure they understand what a competency is, provide real life scenarios, ask questions, redirect if necessary, insert learning checks along the way. So now a student clicks on that and they just immediately say, welcome to the NRSD discussion on learner competencies. And when you think learner mindset, what's a scenario? So it engages one-on-one, but the goal of that is engaging students who might not otherwise be engaged, engaging students who wouldn't raise his or her hand and say, I don't really understand perseverance. This gives a totally, they're held harmless in terms of asking those questions or getting clarifying questions or being prompted to think further. Mm-hmm. Now, this particular tool, the teacher on the dashboard side of it, I can watch every student's interaction. It summarizes their mood, their progress, but I can also watch the entire process. So for me, that's like AI utility. This isn't 18 months ago where it was ChatGPT and we were worrying about students cheating on tests. This is totally different. This is a different engagement process. And, for me, that's where we're moving past, like the quote says, moving past novelty toward utility. And that's the part that's exciting for me, is that the engagement. And again, putting it in an authentic experience for student, even though it's artificially intelligent, it's an authentic experience for a student because every individual student is engaged in ways that are going to be meaningful to them because they're just talking and thinking, and yes, they can actually speak now through text to speech and speech to text. So there's an accessibility point that I think it affords as well. But it's really just that engagement piece. And that was the idea of designing it. And they're kind of, templates, they're kind of early incarnations and there will be future iterations. But, for me, I wanted to think about 3 different modes, from like a UDL point of view, 3 different modes that students can engage differently, express differently, display, connect. So, that feels very different from asking teacher on your lesson plan, which of the 6 competencies does the same lesson plan you've used for 20 years, right? It's a lot different from just mapping out the same activities and just tagging competencies. It's really the driver behind the process. One of the things our district also did was have student created videos where high schoolers, they said, what does grit mean to you? What does perseverance mean to you? And they introduced for each other through a homeroom model what the learner competencies looked like. So anyway, I know I've been rambling a lot.
I just think, it's really critical as we kind of heard of those different modes. Is a trend that underlaid all of them was that you were really reinforcing the awareness factor. You were helping students to name these competencies and put that kind of first and foremost in front of them. So it's not like you're using different language. The language was there, so they're starting to make those connections. But what I think was really insightful was by doing so, you're then prompting them to dive deeper, do some deeper learning, and critically reflect. But it all came back to you put it in the hand of the student. Right. And you found a way that resonates with how the student wants to engage. And in doing so, you're able to just have that student go through this process, but just in a way that makes sense to them. And I think that's a real critical aspect. So many of the leaders that we talk to as they are looking at ways to embed their portrait of a graduate into their day-to-day are thinking about, oh, we need to create resources, or we have to equip our teachers with lesson plans or activities. And there's a million different ways that I've seen and that we've had leaders come on even to this show to talk about how they're approaching it. But a big difference in what you're building upon is putting it into the student's hands first and removing the need for the teacher to be a facilitator. And you're also cognizant of the fact that this is the first iteration, and then you're going to iterate on it, and you're not going to let it just become a stagnant, I've done it, let's move on. No, we're going to come back to this, and we're going to continue making it a lot smoother, better, and insightful. That's
the goal. Well, thanks for recognizing it. I mean, when it's in the hands of those students, you're right. You're either bypassing or you're going directly to the source, right? How often do we see these portraits where it's almost like the students are, you're like, where do the students fit into this poster, when really that's what it should be all about. But I think that can be overlooked, or it's not always just highly visible. And if you're truly a student-centered model, then don't forget to be so.
I love the call out to reinforcing that student-centered model. I think all of us strive in education to be student-centered, but when you are balancing priorities, it's easy to shift away and go with what you're familiar with, which might not have the student in the center and put that emphasis on it. So I think that's just a really important call out at this stage of our conversation, to continue to keep that student-centered aspect front of mind as you're having conversations and discussing this. But Jed, I'm really curious, because we've talked about, empowering the student, capturing their voice, and visualizing where they stand. And, I think in having that idea of visualization, it also is helpful because the student gets to see where they are and be able to self-reflect and start making connections and say, hey, wow, I'm really great at communicating, but problem solving is an area that I want to self-improve upon. So, that is an important call out in and of itself. But as we're thinking and speaking, in your latest book, you talk a lot about building a culture around content creation. And I'm really curious as to how you see this fitting in with ideas around the portrait of a graduate and as you're looking to roll this out.
I think the book you're talking about is called Beyond the Bulletin Board, Crafting a Culture of Content Creation, available at Amazon. Is that the book you're talking about?
That's the one. That's the one.
Real subtle. I wrote that book. I really wanted to think about exactly what we're talking about. It mentions and it talks about a portrait of a graduate and our profile of a learner and the importance of portfolios, digital portfolios, or just the reason why portfolios have always been a really important part of the process, whether they're digital or not. But the idea of, hopefully the title Beyond the Bulletin Board says it all. Right. And it's no different from the conversation we're having that really asks the challenging question, why are we decorating our halls and walls? Who are you hoping are going to see those student products? And are those products all the same? Are they all different? So there's 3 parts to the book. The first part, they are practical strategies for leveraging digital tools to support learning, because I've been kind of in that ed tech space, but it's not about the operation of tools. It's really about capturing teaching and learning and lifting the digital literacy in those spaces in ways that are going really just sometimes very simple. Are you building a bulletin board, the same bulletin board you've made for 20 years? I'm not saying don't collect that same winter poetry, but what I might be saying is, can we increase the audience of that winter poetry? Could you put a QR code that captures a student reciting the poetry? Sometimes just shifts. And like you said, it's not new or different lesson plans. There's a reason a teacher has done something 20 years in a row. And honoring that and respecting that and looking for ways to enhance that has been my way in, either as a coach or administrator. So part 2 of the book is what I call Designing for Digital Literacy, a DDL model. And that's really built around 4 domains of digital literacy. Those domains being instruction, operation, creativity, and wellness. Wellness being digital citizenship, but a whole lot more than just digital citizenship. Sometimes digital citizenship just gets, wrapped into protecting your password and carrying your Chromebook carefully, when we're really talking about a whole different wellness approach, with whether it's students online, their digital footprint, who are they interacting with, parents calling the school and saying they're on YouTube at 11:30 at night and you gave the device. And that is a different conversation about wellness. And that invites more people to the table rather than just who's deploying that lesson. But the second part of the title, crafting that culture of content creation, goes back to really, for me, what was a transformational, the first time I heard that phrase about shifting students from being content creators from being content consumers toward content creators. And it's become kind of ubiquitous and buzzy, but it was transformational for me. And I think sometimes, maybe through and post-COVID, parents have this interpretation of kids just sitting in front of their screens and a very directional flow of content, when really I'm advocating for those digital tools being put in the hands of students for creation, for expression, for different ways of demonstrating their learning, for exactly what we talk about with a portrait of a graduate. How are they demonstrating those very competencies as a creative tool? Because they're doing it when they get home. Why aren't we pretending the real world exists right in school as well? So that DDL model is the design for digital literacy. And I love talking about that model because, if you're an administrator, if you're a classroom teacher and you say, okay, this school year, I'm going to work on technology with my class. That's too big. So what I would say is, well, what aspect? Even, we boil it down to AI. Okay, but what of those 4 domains are we talking about? Is it instruction? Is it operation? Is it creation? Or is it wellness? Which of those 4 pieces? And it's a great goal-setting exercise. It's a great coaching cycle exercise because it gives the educator a frame. This is really articulating what I want to work on, what I need to know, where I'm most comfortable. The same way, those protocols for students, to put it in the hands of the student, to see where they land and where they stand. That framework is doing that exact same process with teachers to say, no, I'm really comfortable. I'm a digital native, rah, rah, rah. But that doesn't mean I know how to be an effective teacher with technology. So it's the instructional part, whereas another teacher might say it's the operational part. And I can promise you, I have for 30 years, and this going into year 31, I suspect I will still be having copy-paste demos, and I will also be having high-end AI integration with a UDL focus conversation. So, it's that whole span of focus. But if teachers and educators and their leaders can articulate, is it the instruction, operation, wellness, or creativity we're talking about, those 4 domains, because everything we're asking them to do falls within those domains. And then you set the conditions for that culture that the content creation asks for. And I think the conditions, for those conditions to be right, when they are right, the byproduct there is you've got engaged students and engaged teachers. There's authenticity in the learning experiences. There's authenticity in the audience. There's authenticity in the purpose of the skills that you're asking students to complete. There's application, so that learner transfer is on display. There's differentiation automatically because you are giving options, and hopefully you're not giving totally different activities. There's differentiation within those same, and that's where for me AI is really huge at looking at ways. I mean, even from a classroom teacher point of view, where I was looking for alternate texts, alternate articles for different groups at different tables and different small group instruction. Well, I had to find a Time for Kids article because this one is, now you have the ability with a single click to shift a Lexile level. That's really thinking about technology differently. And that's setting that culture, I think, for success. And all the while that I'm glad you really kind of named it, that self-awareness through whether it's self-assessment, self-reflection, but the goal is really just awareness and understanding. Because if we're honest and we're really being both generous and vulnerable as the adults in the room, as the lead learners in the space, that's when students are going to respond differently and engage differently in ways that matter.
And I think it's just really important that, we're calling out the idea of modeling these actions. But I just appreciate, throughout our dialogue, you haven't been talking about the need to measure everything and track everything. I think that that's just part of your philosophy towards these items, because it just, again, as I'm hearing the work being done, we just want to really reiterate to our teachers that because, yes, you're supporting these models or you're bringing these ideas in and you're naming these competencies and developing it, it doesn't need to be one more item to be measured. And there's a lot of debate out there in the world, in the academic literature, about do we measure competencies or do we not? And what does measurement look like and who owns measurement? And I think, what I'm hearing as we're talking about comes back to, let's just put that student in the center, make them self-aware, self-reflect, and pull in real world applications. And we don't need to always have a measurement towards everything. And it comes back to this big misconception around competency-based models of, if I don't grade it, the students won't do it. Well, I think, Jed, you're really highlighting that by engaging students with real world applications, that they're gonna do the work, but they're gonna be more engaged in the work.
That's it. I mean, I think some of it just comes down to like that fixed mindset of what measurement is and what the metrics of measurement have to look like. A demonstration of a learner competency, if a student can do that, that is a measurement. That is an assessment, right? If a student can demonstrate a skill, it might just require a teacher to really reframe how they think about how it's collected. And it doesn't mean you have to put a score on it. Right. Mm-hmm. There's a difference between scoring and measuring, and there's a difference between curating that demonstration and then assigning a judgment to it. So yeah, it's complicated and it's hard, which is probably why, the ones that are the easiest and fastest are pretty two-dimensional.
Sure. As we're chatting a lot about setting the conditions for the culture of creation, we talked obviously about the student and the teacher. I'm curious about the family. In all of this, how do you see family interplaying as this culture is being created?
Well, that's a really good question. I had a conversation earlier today, as a matter of fact, because I'm beginning a conversation with different leaders about looking at portraits. And he was saying, when his kids went through school, they did a portrait of a graduate work, and he got the parent surveys, and he honestly had no sense of where that information went, where that data went, or why it was important. And he talked about building a team around his daughter, whether it was through tutors or therapy or whatever it was. And it was almost like, in spite of this portrait of a graduate effort, in spite of the profile of a learner his district said they were doing, he felt like there was zero communication. Right. And it was not my district, by the way, not even my state. So just want to make that clear. But to me, that, he talked about having a team of 9. And I was showing him those tools I described, and he was saying how valuable those tools would be, because it would have given his daughter the vocabulary to talk about, learner competencies differently. It would have given himself and herself and a teacher like a really closer team to be able to be talking about the same things in ways that matter. So I think, yes, it's having parents part of the conversation. It's more than just buy-in. I think it's got to matter, because what student wouldn't want to understand their child more fully? Right. And what parent wouldn't want to know that their school is looking to understand their student rather than how their student measures against other students, other states, or the curriculum or the students before. I think that piece is really important to having parents not be on board. I don't want to say that, but understand why the investment of time and energy is really important.
I think it's just really important, and my personal belief as well is that is helping us move away from such a competitive nature of our schools in terms of a family feeling they need to compare their student to other students from a test score perspective. Yep, and then 100%. If my student isn't, testing up to the level of somebody else, what does that mean? And I just love that these frameworks are moving away from that and determining better ways to support the student with what matters for their future, and engaging families in a lot more insightful way. And you've spoken a lot about strategies to help doing that. And I think it just boils down to, for our district partners, you need to consider a communication vehicle. How are families going to be included on this? And it's a challenging question to answer, and there's a lot of different technology solutions that support that communication. There's a lot of different vehicles to do that, but it's a critical factor that has to be taken into consideration early in your planning phase, and think about what's the best way to engage those stakeholders, especially if you're in an area where, hey, maybe mom and dad or guardian can't come in at 3:30 on a Tuesday afternoon to have a dialogue with the family. So think about those support systems and how that might come into play about this model.
Yeah, I think about the communication to parents, right? About that. And please don't wait all the way till the end to give a score sheet, give a profile poster of your student. But I also think about the direction different, the other way too, where students are, where parents are contributors, or students over the weekend, or students when they're on a trip with their family are seeing those moments as elements that fill in their profile as well, right? The learning does not happen only between 8 and 2 or whatever. That learning is happening throughout. And if students can make that connection where they're out to dinner and they see, prices on a menu and they suddenly connect with something, fraction lesson in math, or more importantly, they're traveling with their family and they encounter a challenge that they overcome, or they're just at a museum and they make connections. It's like, it widens their world, and it removes some of the walls in between in ways that I think builds that involvement and builds that partnership. And if parents feel like there's any level of partnership, I think there's just more of an authentic opportunity there.
Connecting those moments authentically, I think, is just such an important call out, and providing students the opportunity to make those connections. I love saying, hey, learning happens everywhere. And
right.
That was a big factor when I was a classroom teacher that I struggled with, was not having a way to celebrate those moments in between benchmarks. That was where I actually fell in love with teaching, was for those moments, but there was no vehicle to say, let's celebrate it, let's bring visibility and focus on those. And I think, you're just calling out that's kind of the core of what teaching and learning is about. And it's now a really unique way to celebrate those moments and opportunities. But Jed, as we're kind of wrapping up our conversation here today, I'm curious, from your lens, with your background and your philosophy towards teaching and learning, like, why do you see initiatives like the Portrait of a Graduate being so critical to the future of our K-12 education system?
You could change that question to an answer by replacing one little word. Instead of critical to the future of education, it's critical to their future. And it is. It's an AI economy that's waiting for students, and it's not just their future, it's their present. Mm-hmm. And we want to, whoever said that quote about preparing students for our past or their future totally nailed it, because it really is about their future. And in our kind of post-COVID learning landscape, it looks and should look a lot different. That think about not just ninth graders, what will it look like 4 years from now, but think about kindergartners. Mm-hmm. What are the skills we need to be developing across the next 12 years that are going to equip them for their future? And the truth is, we don't know, right? We don't know all of it. Yes, the classics will never go out of style. But if we're so adherent to those classics and so adherent to whether it's core content that remains unchanged or core pedagogy that remains unchanged, we're distancing ourselves from, it's more and more when kids talk about when they leave school or when they get into the real world, where, they're already in the real world, and we're crazy to think that they're not, and we're crazy not to be giving them the tools to be succeeding in their real world right now.
Just hearing this story makes me just think, again, back to something you mentioned a little bit ago, having the opportunity to model. It's giving all educators a really great opportunity to model this process of reflecting and iterating and working towards supporting. And through modeling, it's going to just help that student do the very same thing. Reflect, iterate, and focus on the process of their learning and not always the product to make it go into their real world.
It's a vulnerable task that you're asking, right? If we're asking students to be vulnerable and, create that ring, create that hexagon and see where they're strong, well, it's also going to, it's going to illustrate where they can work. And not every teacher wants to present that three-dimensional picture of themselves, or they're not ready to see where they need to grow. Or when it comes to just like any other technology, teachers, it has not been their job historically to teach themselves every new thing that came along.
Right.
And so there's that vulnerability in just, as you say, modeling. It's like hopefully modeling the learning process too, not just modeling the way to do something,
Sure,
but modeling the way to learn something. And you did it earlier when you talked about finding ways to build connections between the benchmarks.
right.
And part of it is making the connections among the benchmarks too, where, the benchmark isn't something other than real life. The benchmark can be connected to something in life in ways then that matter to student. And that's kind of the craft, right? Is making it matter, making it real. Why does this matter? And it might be easier in some subject areas or content areas in other, but when it boils down to learning how to learn, learning how to adapt a challenge, learning how to think about ways to demonstrate that understanding, that's pretty universal across content areas.
Talking all about developing a culture around content creation, being vulnerable, and supporting our students with their future, which really is beginning today. Jed, it's so amazing to have you on the show. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights and for spending the last, 50 or so minutes with us. How can people find out more about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, that time went by fast. Woo. I'm on Twitter for a little while longer. X, we'll see how long I can I can last. But at Stefanowicz 135, and yes, Stefanowicz rhymes with Bananowitz. I didn't even have to tell you that. You can also find me at jedpd.com, as in Jed Professional Development. So jedpd.com. You can find my books on Amazon. And on fine podcasts like this. So reach out, find me. I'd love to, talk with teams, talk with schools, or just talk trash about you name it.
All right, Jed. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Jordan, great to see you. Thank you for having me.
That was author, innovator, and director of digital learning and innovation, Jed Stefanowicz. Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show, and please make sure to hit the follow button on your podcast app so you never miss an episode. I'm Jordan Lewis, and you've been listening to the Growth Over Grades podcast.